Before starting today's exercise, you'll want to install .NET 5.0 and Visual Studio 2019. Community Edition is fine. Today we intend to play with C# a little, and we'll do that by creating a console application. All right, let's start by creating a little playground for today's exercise. Let's create a directory. In this case, I've got .NET C# console. And let's move on to opening Visual Studio 2019. All right, let's start by creating a new project. We'll look for console app. You can just search for that. We want to choose the one with the little C# icon. That's the console app.NET Core. We'll click next. We're going to name that. That's the .NET C# console. And then I'm going to put it at the parent level of that, so it just creates it flush with that new folder we created. Then, ta-da! So now we've got some generated code. This is our templated project with program.cs open. You look in the Solution Explorer window, and you can see what's already been generated. Double-clicking to be able to select a specific item. Note that the program here is already written to output to console the value hello world. If we want, we can just build this. It succeeded, and we can debug it. Note that extension F5. And voila, hello world. Now, at the time of recording this, there's actually a template that is sort of missing from my version. If I double-click this project, it actually is trying to be a .NET Core 3.1 project. So I'll just replace that personally with .NET 5.0. If you get any errors, it might be because you don't have .NET Core 3.1 installed, and so .NET 5.0 being what we installed, that's what we want to run. You just edit that project file, and then save it, and then do the build and run, and it'll work. There you go. Now, the default templated code here actually takes in an array of strings as an argument that's just default within this application. So let's actually use that. So instead of saying hello world here, we can just say args index 0, so the first item in the args array. So that's whatever the first argument passed in, we'll just do that. Then let's right click on this project here, go to properties, debug, and application arguments. This is just a quick way to be able to pass arguments to our project for testing. And let's put something in there like non-0 days sample code. And then we can save and run that. And look, it passes that right in. Note that this works because of the string I put around that. If you don't put those quotation marks, then it'll just do the non-zero most likely. Yeah. So what happened there is that instead it's splitting on that space, so it becomes a selection of arguments that are passed rather than a single argument. Now let's see what happens if we don't pass in an application argument. Save that, run that. It actually gets an exception. This is a bad thing. We don't want those. So we didn't have an argument, so index 0 didn't exist. That's an error. We're going to use an if statement to get around that. Let's guard our code. So if args.length is less than 1, so that's to say the length is 0 or less. It could be an error, I guess. Then we want to go ahead and write console write line, no input received. Otherwise, that's an else. Let's do what we were expecting. Let's save that, run that. And hey, no input was received. Further, if we go back in here, we enter something like banana. And get banana back. Woohoo! Now let's remember, if we had put a selection of multiple items into this argument chain, it's only the first one that's going to get used. So let's do that. Let's put a selection of different arguments. Bunny, cat, non-zero days. Save that, run it. We'll see. We only got bunny. So we should use a for loop, and let's iterate over those arguments, show each of them. To do that, we're going to go to the program.cs file again. And right here, let's use what's called a code snippet. It's a variety of different code practices that are just built in. You can reference. Type for, without caps lock preferably, but it doesn't matter here. And you'll note the first item is a code snippet for a for loop. Just tab twice. And we get ourselves a nice little for loop. Just hit enter there. Instead, we put args.length as the ceiling for our index that we're going to create. And let's take that console write line in here and put args of I instead. So this means I equals 0 until we reach args length. Let's increment by 1. That means instead we're just going to be iterating through this. Now if we run, we see bunny, bat, and non-zero days. All right, that was cool, but let's consider using like a text file input instead. Right-click the project, add new item, and then let's find text file. Cool. We can go ahead and name this maybe test.text. Click that guy, and you see the properties tab below. You could also just right-click properties if you don't see that. And for an output, we're going to go ahead and just copy this to the output. Cool. Now let's put some sample text here. I'm going to put something subtle. Multiple lines, several text items. Then over here, this doesn't matter anymore. We'll go ahead and close that. Going back to program CS in here, just going to replace that entire thing. So we know about console write line. But inside of that, instead, let's do a system IO. There's a library called file in that, which has a read all text, and you can just supply a path to the file. In this case, because we know test.text is going to be at the output when we build and run, we can just directly pass that. And we can go ahead and get rid of the rest of this for the purpose of our next test. Save that, run it, and voila, we have it all. It just read all the text to a string and then output that string in console out write line. Now let's mix it up a little. Let's use the input string and write that to the file and then read that out. We can keep this. We can just know what was the original content. This is just a way of saying, hey, I'm going to read this file. Don't know what was in it, but here you go. Here's what it was. And then further, suppose we are actually sent a string. So we want to make sure that that length is greater than 0, that we actually were sent an argument. Then we can do that. I'm going to write to that file we know should be there. And we'll do arg0. We're just writing the first thing that was passed in. We could iterate there if we wanted, but for now this is fine. And we can write out what the content of the file is. Oh my goodness, I made a mistake. Here we are. And then system.io.file read all text. Now this should read what the content of the file was, write our input to it if there was input text arguments, just the first one, and then read out what it is now. This goes back to that project properties. In debug, and we see we're passing in multiple. Since we only really care about the one, let's go ahead and write non-zero days here. This will be great. Run it. So the content of the file was, and is now, and voila, we did it. Now, before we end today, I want to call out something. Right here in a variety of different places, we use what's called a magic variable. It's just a hard-coded string sitting in the middle of our code. It's somewhat frowned upon. You can get away with it in smaller applications like this, and so we took advantage of that today. But in an enterprisey situation, what happens in larger code bases is somebody wants to change this to maybe text.text instead of test.text. And now everywhere that test.text was ever referenced needs to be updated to text.text. So you might want to store that in a different place so that everybody can refer to that, maybe in a class level variable, if it's just in one class, or in a resource file or something somewhere else that can be called into for each of the contexts that has to reference that. Today we played with C# console applications. We did a little bit of input-output, both just console input-output as well as file input-output. We learned a little bit about conditional ifs and for loops in the context of C#. So that was quite a bit that we covered there. If you're giving yourself a little bit more time today, feel free to play around with any of that or look into some of the other loops like for each or while. If not, congrats on a non-zero day.